Hey, are you looking to learn JavaScript in 2020? If so, you found the right video. Today I'm going to be covering the reasons you would want to learn JavaScript, like why it's a great language to be learning in 2020, and why it's also a great first language to learn. I'll dive in and cover a lot of basics of JavaScript, and I strongly encourage you to go through and actually go through this code with me and write it out yourself. It's just really important to get that practice, and it really sets the groundwork for moving on to more advanced topics that I'll cover in future videos that will include things like how you would actually use JavaScript in your day-to-day, how you keep a certain level of quality, how you do testing, working with the DOM, which is like working with web pages more or less, working with APIs, that kind of stuff. But today, just going to be going through the fundamentals. I think in 2020, it's a really interesting choice for your first programming language, or even your second, just because traditionally JavaScript's been used and earlier in my career, just kind of mostly in web browsers and just doing some manipulation of the web page or helping to build it out. And then kind of as time went on, it evolved into doing real-time updates, doing AJAX calls and then updating the page based on those calls. And then it kind of just keeps evolving, and so it's getting used for more and more interactivity on pages, but also, working with APIs and updating things based on those APIs. And then you can do JavaScript full stack now. So with Node, you can even run your backend and write all that code in JavaScript. And then even more recently, over the past 5 years or 5-10 years maybe, it's becoming a common way also to build out mobile applications. So it's just ubiquitous. Like, you can work with it pretty much anywhere. It's just always in demand. There's always a need for JavaScript developers. And it's kind of an interesting spot too. Like, the language has matured and it's changed over the years. And I think it's in a much better place now than it's ever been. And something you'll find too is it's really difficult to get your first programming job. And I think with JavaScript, it's just so in demand that it should be relatively easy to find a job using it. And then as engineers either work with the backend more or just get more into their career, I've personally seen them kind of like move on to other languages that they want to try out that are kind of more specialized or have a different approach to things. It's an interesting language because there's always availability at each kind of skill level, which makes it very interesting for trying to find jobs. And as I mentioned too, it's evolved over the years. So now I would say it's much nicer to work with than it was when I started. It's definitely much nicer to work with. And you may have heard of TypeScript as well. That's kind of an additional like evolution of what you can do with JavaScript that uses types. But I'll cover all that in a different video. But yeah, basically just want to cover the fundamentals here. I encourage you to actually go through them with me and like type them out and then, practice these as well on your own. It's super easy to practice these. I'll show you exactly how to just jump in and start trying things out. But yeah, I think you're making a great choice, and look forward to going through all of this with you here in a second. So I've got, just so you can see it for a second, I'm using this REPL.it site. And this is a great place to go to just try out lots of different kinds of languages, but JavaScript's an easy one to just jump in and try here. You notice too, before we get started, we have an index.js file, so that's the file we're going to be working in. .js just means it's a JavaScript file. And as if we want to run anything that we've typed in over here, we can just hit this run button right here. And then anything that's output from this side will print out over here. And if we wanted to, also on the right side, we could just go ahead and type in something. So we could do 2 + 2, and that's going to be evaluated as JavaScript. And when I hit enter, you'll see that that's going to give us 4. So yeah, the first place I wanted to start was just showing you how to output something. And so if you're in a browser in particular, you can just use console.log and then parentheses, and then just put some, they call them expressions, but just something in there that you want to run. And then we'll go ahead and do that. And you should see on the right here, it'll take a second to run. There we go, we've got 4. So this is relying on this object and this method here to just output whatever we put in here. And I'll explain a little more about what all that means here in a bit. I'm mainly concerned about showing you we can run something that's on the left side here and then have it come out on the right side. So yeah, a good starting point is just showing that this is code that runs. And if we want to have something in here that doesn't run, that's generally referred to as a comment. There's a couple different ways you can do comments. So the style for doing it on one line is just 2 slashes, and then you can say this is some code, and then that will just basically just get ignored when the codes run. And we should just see 4 again over here. It may not be obvious that it's run. And then if you want to have longer comments where you just, maybe are like documenting what the code's doing, you can use this style where it's a slash asterisk and then asterisk slash, and you can do multi-line comments. So this is a comment, and that'll still work for you. And yep, so this is code that'll run, this is code that won't run, or just text or whatever. And sometimes this is useful because you may have several of these that you're looking at, and you may just want to comment one of them out so it doesn't run if you're not interested in it for some reason. So if I just threw a couple slashes in front of that and I run it again, then you can see it's gonna just ignore this one. So it just has 5, just outputting 5 and 7 at this point. So with that, I'm gonna remove some of this stuff and move on to kind of the first topic that I wanted to cover with JavaScript, and that is primitives. So primitives are just the kind of fundamental building blocks within the language, and JavaScript has a small set of them. I'm going to run through them here quickly. So the way that you can tell what the type of the thing is that you're working with in JavaScript is a function called type of, and you can give it one of these values, and I'm just going to do a console.log on this. So if we ask what the type of a number is, or if we ask what the type of 4 is here, and we run that, it's going to tell us that it's a number. And then if we change that to what's called a string, which is usually could either be in single or double quotes, but I'm going to use double quotes for this. If we ask what the type of that is, it's going to tell us that that is a string. And a string is just any set of continuous characters that are together. So a name or even like a single letter in quotes would still be considered a string in JavaScript. And then we can also do Booleans. So here we will say what's the type of true, and that's going to come back as a Boolean, and that'll work for either true or false. So that'll also be a Boolean. And then I'm going to move on to an object. So I'll get more into this in a bit, but these double curlies represent an object in JavaScript, and I'm going to ask JavaScript to ask or tell us what that is, and it is in fact going to tell us it's an object. And then there's a couple other interesting ones. So in most languages, there's a concept called nil or null that represents just the lack of a value. And JavaScript does something a little surprising with this. I'll show you what that looks like. So it is in fact, the type of it's in fact an object, which is a bit surprising. It's usually null in other languages. And then you can also ask for, there's another special value called undefined, which just means you haven't set a value, or that the variable isn't even declared, but you can just write it out this way. And that will also give us undefined. So just to kind of reiterate, I'm sorry, I missed one. So there's also functions. So I will just bring in an example of one of those. And again, I'll cover these these different things in more detail. I just want to show you what these primitives are first. And it is, in fact, telling us that the type of that is a function, which is what we would expect. So just to kind of quickly reiterate what these primitives are, I'm going to bring this list over here. So we have number, string. So number is, 4 or 4.0 or anything like that. String is going to be anything in quotes, and that's usually like a name or some text or a single letter. A Boolean is going to be true or false, or anything that evaluates to true and false. An object is something that's got some other complexity I'll explain in a bit. A function is, you can think of this as like a mathematical function, like addition or subtraction. Like if you add two things, that would be a function that takes two numbers and then gives you a number back. Null, which represents just not having a value set, and undefined can represent either not having a value set or not even having like a variable defined. So those are the kind of basic, the primitives that you have in JavaScript, and not too exciting, but they're good. They're just something you have to know. So I just wanted to go through those first, and then the next topic I wanted to move on to is variables and assignments. So in JavaScript or in any language, you have these things called variables. And it's just anything that can hold a value and that you can reference to get that value. And the value could be any of those different kinds of primitives that we looked at, or it could be something like a list or an array. But the idea is you just want to be able to use a name to refer to something. So kind of the older style of doing this in JavaScript was to do something like this, where you have a variable. So here this is just saying we want a variable, and that variable's name is going to be a, and we're going to assign to a this value of 5. And when we do this, it's actually setting the value of a to 5. And then if we were to go and ask what's the value of a after we do that, and we run this, you're going to see it's going to be 5. And then another way you could accomplish this is to use let. And that's kind of the preferred way now for a variable that you'll reassign values to. But we'll just use it here as an example. So we will let a equal 5. And if we run this again, we'll just get 5 output from this console.log. And then one other way you can do this is to use const. And this is for, this is a constant. And it just means that this value isn't going to get reassigned. There's some nuances to this, but more or less it means you're not going to do, at any point, you're not going to do this again. So it'll prevent you from being able to do that. And generally, if you're not going to change the value of something, then, or you're not going to reassign it, that's the preferred, it's preferred to use that over let, just to make it clear that it isn't going to change. And so we'll just run that. And again, we'll see we get 5. And then something that's kind of interesting to look at too is that if you were to have another variable and you set it to a, I guess it's just a question for you to think about for a second, but what would you expect the output of this to be? And we will run it here just to show you. So that's 5. But what's interesting about this, I'm actually going to switch this to a let. So we're letting a be 5. We're letting a equal 5. We're setting b equal to a. If I was to change a now, think about it for a second. What you would expect to see if we went ahead just did a console.log of b. So the two answers will probably be either 5 or 10. So we actually got 5. So what's happening is this isn't keeping a reference or a reference or a pointer to a and using whatever value a has, it's actually copying the value that's currently in a, which is 5, over to b. And then so even if we update the value of a, we're still going to get b, whatever the original value was that we set when we set b equal to a. So and this is the pattern that's used for primitives. If you assign something to a primitive, it's going to copy the value, and then so if you change that primitive from that point, it's not going to change in your variable. And that isn't the case for every assignment in JavaScript, so I'll cover where that's different here in a bit. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it for assignments. Something else that you will use a lot in really any programming language, but you'll definitely use a lot in JavaScript as well, is arrays. I'm just going to put a note up here that that's what we're talking about. So with arrays, all an array really is like a list, an ordered list of things that you want to be able to store and retrieve and manipulate. So you might have something like a list of, say, just a few numbers you want to keep track of. Maybe it's, let's just use something maybe more meaningful. So maybe these are like the ages you need to be in order to see a certain kind of movie or something. So maybe it's like 8 years old, I don't even know, 13, 18. Just use those as examples here. And that's not going to output anything because we didn't do a console log. So here I'll just log that out. And here you can see it's just going to output this list. And what you can do is, sorry, just a quick note too. In JavaScript, technically you should end lines of JavaScript with a semicolon, but you can actually get away with not doing it in a lot of cases, but it can trip you up kind of in unexpected ways. So it's generally recommended to always put a semicolon at the end of a line. And then you don't have to worry about any ambiguity. So I'll start including those in whatever I'm doing here. But with this ages array defined, we can access different values inside of ages here. So we may want to access this value, or this value, or this value. And to do that, the syntax for that is going to be square brackets, and then you just give the index, or you give the position essentially of the item in the list that you're interested in. And in most programming languages, the index will start at 0 instead of 1, which is a little counterintuitive, and that's called a zero-based index. So if you wanted 8, for example, you would use 0 here. And then if we use 1 and then 2, I would expect this to output 8 and then 13 and then 18. And that's what we get. And then you can also attempt to access a position that isn't set in the list. So let's just go ahead and do this. So this would try to access the next position, which would be like the 4th thing in the list, but there isn't actually a value set for that. So let's see what it does. And that's just going to give us undefined. So there's one of our primitive values coming back, and it makes sense in this context. It's just saying there isn't actually any value set for that, so it's just going to give you undefined. And you can also do things like you could reference you could set a value for the 3rd position. So maybe that's, for some reason, maybe there's a 21-year age restriction on a certain kind of movie, and we can just set the value for the 3rd position of ages to 21, and then we should see when we do this that the value 21 comes out. And there you go. So there's a lot that you can do with lists. It's too much to cover right now, but I will have some more advanced videos that go into more depth on like how you actually want to use these different data structures and primitives, but I just wanted to kind of give you a brief intro into what arrays are. Generally, you'll use them when you're tracking sets of things that you want to be able to reference like this, like reference them by a numeric index, or make sure you keep in a certain order. So the next topic I wanted to cover here are functions. And again, there's a lot we could cover with this. I'm just going to kind of cover the basics. So we did look earlier at what a function looks like. I'm going to bring an example of one in here. So what we have is, you'll see this function keyword, and then after that, this will be the name of the function. And if we wanted to pass any parameters here, we could, parameters or arguments. And what those would be are, like, if we wanted to print out a name, we could put in, say, like a name parameter. And then we could refer to that over here. But for now, I'm just going to keep it simple. So this is a function called hello that has no parameters or arguments. And then this syntax here, these curlies, just say this is all everything inside these curlies is what we want to run when we call this function. And then a function should always return, should usually return a value. Typically should return a value. So here this is just saying when this is run, we want to return, and then whatever comes after return is going to come back. So this will return a string called a string of hello when it's called, and we can just verify that here. So again, we're going to console.log, and then in order to execute this function, or to call it, we have to use this syntax, which is two parentheses, open and close parentheses after it, and then that will in fact call hello, which returns this value, and then console.log is going to output that value. And if we wanted to, we could, pass a greeting in, as I mentioned earlier. So we could change this to take a greeting and just print out whatever that greeting is, and then we could say hola, and when we run that, it is going to say hola instead. And you can kind of get an idea of the power of functions here. So you can have them do something consistently, but change based on whatever input you give them, and that's kind of the basics of what a function is. It should always return the same thing given the same inputs, or generally it should. That's called deterministic. If it did something random, that would be non-deterministic. And then another interesting thing you can do is you can actually assign a function to a variable. So instead of naming it here, we're just going to do this. Let me pull this over here a little bit more. So what we're doing here is we're saying, hey, we've got this variable. So we're going to say let a equal a function, and this is called an anonymous function because it doesn't have a name now. And that function takes a greeting and returns the greeting. And then instead of calling it by hello, now we can just call it by a. And since a is just equal to this, we can call it just like we called hello before with whatever our greeting is. And I'll just go ahead and run that. And you'll see it's basically doing the same thing at this point. Now this is kind of a verbose way of defining a function, so I'm going to show you a couple other ways that we can do this. And the first of those is just to get rid of this function keyword here and use this arrow, sometimes called a fat arrow, where this would be a skinny arrow, but this is the fat arrow. And then we should be able to just run this again and see it work as we would expect it to work. There we go. And then you could have multiple lines in here. So maybe we're just doing something else up here. It doesn't really matter what it is. So maybe we say let b equal 5. Could be anything. but this could be arbitrarily long, so the function could be 100 lines long or something if we wanted it to be. But when you have something that's as simple as a one-line function here, there's a special syntax you can use for that, which is just drop the return and the brackets, and use this syntax where you just do fat arrow and then whatever the value is that you want to return. So this will still work. We'll run that. And yeah, that's just more idiomatic. It's a little bit shorter, a little bit easier to read. If you do have functions like this where they're just returning, they're just doing like a one-line return of a value, then this is a good way to write those. I'd say the preferred way to write that. And then just quickly to show you maybe a slightly more interesting function, we could have a function called add that takes two things. So maybe it's A and B, and it's going to return A plus B. And then down here, now we have two parameters, so we need to make sure we update that. So and also the name, we'll change that to add, and then we'll add, say, 5 and 10. And then just go ahead and run that. And there we go, we got 15. And if you wanted to, you could call that same function again and use different inputs. So you could use 15 and 20, and we'll run that again, see what that looks like. So yeah, looking good at this point. So yeah, functions are really great. They're super powerful, and I'll cover what you can do with them a lot more as I go through these videos. But for now, I just want to keep this pretty simple, just because there's a lot to cover. So the next thing I wanted to move on to is scoping with functions. So there's some things here that can be a little surprising. I'm just going to hit this quickly, but you could have, for example, let A equal 5, and you could, or let's actually change this to let C equal 5. And in here, in your function, you can actually refer to this value C. And so now what should happen is down here, these values of 15 and 35 should increase by 5. And I'm just going to run this so you can see that. And there you have these values getting bumped up on the right. So what's happening is even within this function that we've defined, even though we haven't declared an additional parameter, it can still refer to these variables that are defined outside of the function. And sometimes you'll want that and sometimes you won't. It could be a bit surprising. So if for some reason you wanted to always add 5 to whatever values you pass into this, you would probably want to change this to be a multi-line function and return from it. And then in here, you could let C be 5. And just to show this is working the way you would expect, I'm going to set C to 0 up here. Inside this function, I'm going to set it to 5. And then we should see the same result. So again, we're getting 20 and 40. And then if we were to add on to the end of this, another interesting thing you can do with console.log is use commas and output multiple values. So I'm just going to do that here so we can show what C is, because it's not 100% clear what it should be after this. Initially out here it's set to 0, but then within this function we set it to 5. So I just want to show what C is, and we can see that C is in fact still 0. Now the interesting thing here is inside our function we're saying let C equal 5. So we're declaring a new C inside of our function, and when we do that, it's going to refer to this one instead of the one outside of it. But if we were to not declare it and we just set C equal to 5 here, and we run this again, what's going to happen is the function's going to do what we would expect, but then after the function that has been called, C is going to be set to whatever value we set it to here, because this is actually referring to this value of C out here. So if you want to make sure you're getting, you're not tampering with values outside of your function, you want to make sure you're either declaring those here or you're declaring them inside the function. And that concept's referred to as scope or lexical scope. There's a lot more we could go into on that, but just wanted to give you a heads up on that because that can be confusing as you're getting in and kind of writing your first functions. So if you run into surprising behavior there, you probably want to do some Googling for like scope or lexical scope. Now the next topic I wanted to cover here is objects. And sometimes these are referred to as dictionaries in other languages, but and the reason they're referred to as dictionaries is because generally there's you want to look something up by a term and get a value back. So if you think about looking in just like a dictionary, you would look up a word and you would get back the definition of whatever that word is. And that's a really good analogy for what an object is. And we saw earlier just what the simplest object is. So that is going to be the double curly, and that just is how you initialize an object in JavaScript. But as you can see, it's not really useful for much like that. So here we can just output A. And that's just going to tell us we've got this double curly empty object. But if you want to actually start setting those terms and their definitions like you would with with the dictionary, what you would do is you would come in here, and maybe this is meant to represent a person. Let's do that. So we'll have an object that we're going to use to represent a person, and maybe they have a first name, so we will give them a first name. And this is the syntax you'll use. You'll want to use the term, whatever you want to use to reference the value, which is referred to as the key. This is where you'll spell out what the key is, and then you'll follow that with a colon, and then give the value on the right side. And typically, you'll want to include a comma to do for the end of that line. And then you can see now it's just outputting an object with the first name key and the value David. And you could add additional keys and values here. So we could add last name. I'll just use my last name. And we'll run that. And you can see we've got this object with my first name and last name. And then how you would actually use that is you could also say console.log person.firstname, and that'll just give you the value for the first name key. And that's the syntax. That's going to be person or object dot key. And then there's a alternative way you can use to reference that value, which is like this. Use square brackets and then pass in a string for the key. And here we should see David and then David. And we could just as easily change this to last name, and that'll refer to this key. And then if we put in something it doesn't expect, we're going to get undefined for that. And that's referencing. Once you actually have created an object, you can also assign new keys or update the values for existing ones. So we could say at this point first name is equal to Jane. And if we move that up here and we run this, we're going to get Jane for first name. And the interesting thing with this too is you can set properties that weren't on the initial declaration of the object. So you could do like age like this, and then down here we can just change that to age. Actually, we'll just change it to output all of the person object. We can just see what that looks like. And here you go. So now we're adding on additional keys and values. Sometimes you'll hear these referred to as like key value pairs also. But yeah, I mean, this is kind of a fundamental building block in JavaScript. It gets used for a lot of things. These are the basics of how to create one and how to set values on it, how to update values, how to, add additional values. And as I mentioned before, like these are the building blocks. So I'm not going to cover like how all this gets used and what it's good for and what it's bad for in this video, but it'll be important to know what that is, and I'll cover that in a later video. The next thing I wanted to cover here is just some basic Boolean logic. And this really is the backbone of figuring out like making decisions in your language. So, you want to know under these conditions, you want to do a certain thing, or if those conditions aren't met, you want to do a different thing. Or, if the light's on, you want to do one thing. If the light's off, you want to do a different thing. A different way you can ask that question is the light on or is the light not on? And that's the basics of the Boolean logic are what I want to run through here with you. So the simplest form of these Booleans in JavaScript is just the actual true and false values. And I'll just execute that here so you can see what those are. So you can see we have true and we have false. Now what's interesting is you can negate these values by putting a exclamation point, or what's referred to as a bang by programmers generally, in front of either of these, and that'll just reverse it. So that just represents a not. So not true, not false. So it should actually flip the values of those here when we run this. So, and it just did. So true changed to false and false changed to true. And then you can actually do a double bang and it should get it back to whatever its original value was. So if we run that, then it should just be true and false again. So we're starting with true, and then we're saying not true, which is false, and then we're saying not true, or not false. So then that gets us back to true. And just referring to my earlier example, you could have something where instead of having those values, you have something like a variable that represents like is open. And if it is open, you want to do one thing. And if it is not open, you want to do a different thing. So it's not as exciting when you see the literal true and false values there, but just know that those are kind of like building blocks. These are the building blocks that you'll use to kind of make some more interesting behavior. Now there's two other things that we should cover for Boolean logic. That's logical and logical or and or, I should say. And here we'll just want to run through the truth table for true and false. So if something is true and another thing is true, then the whole statement should be true. If something's true and something's false, the overall statement is false because you need them, and means they both need to be true in order for the overall statement to be true. So similarly, anything past here that includes any falses should return false. And we will see that here. So we do have true, false, false, false. And again, the literal values aren't super exciting, but you could be comparing two things that you need to both be true in order to do something. So you could say like is open and is and like has money. So if you're checking if a store is open and you have money, then you can actually, it makes sense to go into the store, for example. And if either of those things aren't true, it wouldn't make sense to go into the store. And then the other side of this is or. So here we're doing ors. And with or, if either of the things that you're interested in are true, then you want the overall statement is true. So anywhere where we have a true where we're using or, we should get back true. So that means this line should be true, this should be true, this should be true, and then this will be false because we don't have true on either side of that. And there we go, we've got true, 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 and false. So yeah, I think that's the basics of Boolean logic. There's more you can do with this, and it gets more interesting as you actually, use it for real code, but that's just kind of the basics of how that works. So yeah, I think this is more or less covers the, kind of the absolute basics and the building blocks that you'll need in order to do some more interesting things. If you're following along, I really encourage you to, take some time to actually run some of this code yourself. Maybe just pull up this exact Replit site and just cut and paste some of these examples that I've provided here. There really isn't any substitute for just getting in and writing code and running it and seeing what it does. It'll help you build up, kind of muscle memory and just some familiarity with the syntax and the language, and knowing what to expect, knowing what it looks like when you run something and it doesn't do what you expect. If we just put in a bunch of junk here, I'm kind of curious what it'll do. I guess it'll probably run. Oh no, see here, we're going to get an error. But yeah, it's just, there isn't really a substitute for just getting in and getting your hands on and trying some of this out. So I strongly encourage you to do that. What I'll be doing is following up with some further videos. So as I mentioned, this covers just kind of the bare bones basics of the language, but in future videos, I'll get into things like control structures. So, if something's true, you want to do one thing. If it's not true, you want to do something different. Or maybe you have a bunch of different cases that you want to check. Like if you have a blue item, you want to do one thing. If you have a red item, you want to do something different. If you have a green item, you want to do something different. Looping over arrays. So say you've got a big array of 50 people and you want to print out all of their first names. I'll show you how to go through and easily do that. If you want to go through like every key and value pair in an object and do something with that, I'll walk through how to handle that situation. And this will all be kind of working up to some more real world or advanced topics where can look at doing things like manipulating web pages and the markup in the web pages and the values in the web pages, working with APIs. So you'll need to know all these kind of basics before you can work with APIs. But once you know this, it's pretty easy to, call it to some API, decide what to do if the call succeeded or it failed. If it succeeds, process whatever information you receive from the API. So I'll be going through some of that. There's other advanced topics too, like synchronous versus asynchronous code. So for example, when you call an API, because you don't have any control over how long it's going to take for that response to come back or whether it's going to succeed or fail. So you need to be able to know how to handle situations like that. And then there's some other just kind of random things, timers. So knowing how to like wait and do something, or how to do something every so many seconds or hours or whatever interval you want to use. And then just some general idioms of writing JavaScript. And then figuring out, I guess another big one is classes, like understanding how classes work, how you use classes, how to organize classes. So anyway, there's a whole bunch of advanced topics, but all of it is totally dependent on understanding these fundamentals. So I wanted to just start with those. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below on the video. And I'm really interested to see what you want to learn, what you want to hear about, where you're getting confused. What I might have missed in this video that would be helpful to cover. And also, maybe let me know a little bit about what you're trying to do. Like, are you trying to get a specific kind of job? Do you want to work with a specific framework? You're trying to get into a specific industry. Do you want to know more about testing? Like, there's all kinds of different directions it could go with this. So, be super helpful for me to hear from you about what you want to know about. But yeah, thanks for watching. Hit subscribe to get more videos in this series. Hit the little bell icon to get notified for when new videos come out. And hit that like button. It really helps me out, helps the channel get some more visibility. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.